The first time Terrence Diddy Chambers heard the name Roderick Vaughn spoken aloud in that courtroom, he didn't flinch. He didn't need to. Years of rehearsed silence had taught him how to absorb explosions like they were compliments. But when Vaughn, the man the world once called R. Vaughn, the disgraced artist in prison khakis and shackled wrists, was sworn in and took the stand, something shifted in the air. It wasn't dramatic, no thunder, no gasp. It was quieter than that. It was the stillness that comes when predators stop pretending they're not being hunted. The jury leaned in, unaware. The judge raised one brow, unreadable. And Diddy simply adjusted the cuff of his jacket like he was preparing to pose for a photo. But then Vaughn looked up. Not at the prosecutor, not at the judge, straight into the crowd. His voice didn't shake, didn't rise. It simply landed like concrete dropped from a rooftop. "They think I was the worst one in the room," he began. "But I wasn't. He was worse than me." He didn't need to say the name. Every cell in the room contracted. Every neck turned slowly toward Diddy like the truth had just pointed a finger. The silence was so loud it felt like an alarm. Cameras had been banned. Phones turned off. But none of that mattered. The real footage was being recorded in the minds of those who couldn't unhear what came next. Vaughn didn't cry, didn't bargain. He explained, carefully, with surgical language, with no self-pity. He talked about the parties, not his, but Diddy He described tiers of access rings within rings. The deeper you were allowed in, the more you were expected to understand the rules. The deeper you went, the fewer witnesses there were. Vaughn told the court how music blared so loud in villas across Miami, LA, even Paris, that no one could hear the begging, the crying, the threats. He recounted how guests arrived with phones and left without them, how girls were flown in from Eastern Europe, the Caribbean, Africa. Many didn't speak English. Some never spoke again. And always, the man behind it all was there. Watching, nodding, orchestrating. Vaughn said it plainly. "You think I ran an operation? He ran an institution." The prosecutor let it hang. The court reporter didn't blink, didn't even shift her chair. Every syllable was oxygen. One juror pressed her hand to her chest like she was steadying her heartbeat. Vaughn continued. "The reason no one talked wasn't fear of me. It was fear of him. Because the money never ran out. Until now." He paused, looked straight at Diddy "He paid people to pull strings so you'd never see the strings. That's power. I didn't have that. I got sloppy. I got caught." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Did you ever witness Mr. Chambers engage in direct acts of coercion or abuse?" Vaughn nodded. "Yes." He didn't hesitate. "I saw him put something in a girl's drink. With his own hand. I saw her drink it. She didn't want to. She said no. They laughed, told her to relax." A gasp rippled across the room like a physical wave. The judge didn't move. The gallery froze. Vaughn looked down for the first time since he began speaking. "I knew where it was headed. I'd seen that look too many times, so I left. Even I couldn't stay." That line, more than any accusation, more than any detail, sunk the room into a swamp of sickness. The man who had once been condemned as a monster was now testifying against a bigger one. A man who had spent years being photographed with presidents, moguls, and saints. A man whose public image had been so carefully manicured, even scandal slid off him like sweat on silk. But here he was, unmasked not by tabloids or expos, but by another monster who had nothing left to protect. The prosecutor asked why Vaughn chose to speak now. Vaughn looked toward the jury. "Because I'm already buried," he said. "But I'm not going to rot alone knowing that man kept walking free after doing worse than me." The gallery remained frozen. Not even the defense took notes anymore. Diddy sat still, hands clasped, jaw lack, eyes forward. Vaughn went on, described parties in detail, faces, names, rooms. One juror blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. Another gripped his pen like it might crack. Vaughn spoke of women who arrived sober and left stumbling, of rooms behind velvet curtains and behind those rooms doors that only opened with the right nod. "They called it the rotation," he said. "A joke, except it wasn't." He spoke of girls with no families, models flown in from Instagram, dancers from music videos. You didn't get in unless you were valuable or invisible. When asked what invisible meant, he replied simply, "Girls nobody would miss." Vaughn was methodical. He wasn't raging. He was unspooling. And that's what made it terrifying. When the prosecutor asked about consent, about force, Vaughn didn't blink. "There was a girl in New York, downtown loft. She said no. I heard her." He laughed. "Told the guy next to him, handle it, and then he walked out like she didn't exist." No one in the courtroom moved, not even the bailiff. Vaughn was rewriting the narrative not just of Diddy but of an industry, of a culture. He wasn't just testifying against one man. He was testifying against a legacy, a machinery built on control, silenced by luxury, powered by fear. He turned to the jury. "They used to say I was the blueprint," he said, almost smiling. "But I wasn't. I was the test run. He perfected it." And for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom no longer looked at Diddy as a man. He was no longer a mogul, no longer a legend. He was just a shadow, watching his kingdom crack. Vaughn's voice faded to a close. The judge called a recess, but no one moved. Even the court artist had stopped drawing, because something irreversible had happened. Not a verdict, not a ruling, just the arrival of truth so heavy it couldn't be dismissed. Vaughn stood, chains at his wrist, head held still, and as he was led out, he glanced one last time at the man who had once ruled everything he feared. No words were exchanged, but everyone in the courtroom felt it. The trial had just changed. Not because the system caught up, but because someone finally decided to stop being silent, and someone else finally couldn't silence him anymore. The courtroom was colder on the second day, not because of the temperature, but because something had cracked open and nobody knew how to close it again. Reporters arrived earlier than usual. Jurors avoided eye contact with each other. And Diddy sat in the same position as the day before, but his suit looked less like armor and more like camouflage. When Vaughn re-entered, shackled and quiet, there was no buzz, no anticipation, just gravity. He didn't speak right away. He waited, almost respectfully, until the judge gave a nod. Then he began, not with a greeting or a preamble, but a story. "It wasn't just the girls," he said. "It was the system." He described a gathering in Los Angeles, a rented mansion with waterfalls and gold-trimmed ceilings. Outside, it looked like heaven. Inside, it was a blueprint for erasure. There were security guards not to keep people safe, but to control who got in and who couldn't leave. There were levels, VIP, super VIP, and then rooms without names, rooms you didn't speak about. He talked about the sound, how the music was so loud you could scream and it wouldn't matter, and the lighting, how it pulsed red and gold like the place itself was breathing. He described how the girls were flown in, some from agencies, some from Instagram, some through recommendations passed like currency. You didn't get invited unless you looked a certain way, acted a certain way, or were desperate enough to stay quiet. Vaughn paused, eyes scanning the room, then landed back on Diddy Comb. He never had to tell anyone what to do. He built an environment where silence was expected, where speaking meant disappearing. The prosecutor stepped forward, carefully. "Can you give us an example?" Vaughn nodded. "San Tropez, 2015. A villa, no phones allowed. Only people who had been to at least 3 of his parties got invited. There was a hallway lined with candles. At the end was a room with girls identically dressed, sitting quietly. No music, no conversation, just waiting." "And what was Mr. Chambers doing?" "Watching," Vaughn said. "Just watching. Like he was proud of what he built." He shifted slightly in his seat, then continued. "There were playbooks, actual instructions. People were trained how to speak, how to de-escalate if a girl panicked, how to present exit gifts that made it look consensual. Luxury handbags, flight tickets, NDA forms slipped between silk lingerie." One juror looked visibly ill. Another was now taking notes in the margins of his legal pad, writing faster than he had the entire trial. The prosecutor asked again, "Did Mr. Chambers personally participate?" "Yes, more than once. He wasn't just attending, he was directing." Vaughn explained how Diddy Comb would arrive late, always with an entourage, always after the environment had been set. He'd give subtle nods, signals to certain men. He didn't give orders, he didn't need to. Everyone already knew. He described a moment in Atlanta. A girl, no older than 19, refused a drink. Someone tried to pressure her. She resisted. Diddy Comb walked in, smiled at her, then whispered to one of his staff. Minutes later, she was gone. Nobody asked where. "She didn't scream," Vaughn said. "She didn't fight. She just looked defeated." He paused again. The courtroom remained motionless. Even the judge had leaned in slightly, hands folded. "You think silence is just about not speaking," Vaughn said. "But in his world, silence was a reward. If you kept quiet, you got invited back. If you smiled, you got perks. If you asked questions, you disappeared." The prosecutor asked, "Did you ever try to warn anyone?" Vaughn nodded slowly. "There was a young artist, just signed. She had potential, was invited to one of his parties. I pulled her aside and said, 'Don't drink what you didn't open. Don't go anywhere alone.' She thought I was paranoid." He looked down. "She never came back to the studio." His voice was steady, but something cracked beneath it. "I don't know what happened to her, but I know she didn't leave that party the same." The jury was now completely still. No coughing, no shifting, just locked in. The gallery, full of reporters and observers, leaned so far forward it was as if they were afraid they'd miss the next breath. The prosecutor asked, "Why do you think people around Mr. Chambers stayed silent?" Vaughn laughed once, not from humor but disbelief. "Because he had footage, he had files, he had people." He explained how celebrities, executives, assistants, they weren't just complicit, they were caught. If you stepped out of line, something would surface. A video, a photo, a contract you forgot you signed. He told the story of a publicist, one of Diddy Combs. She tried to leave, started asking questions, thinking she could expose things. A week later, her career was gone. Stories leaked. She was branded unstable, suicidal. She wasn't, Vaughn said. She was just trying to breathe. The prosecutor stepped back. Did you believe Mr. Chambers kept a library of leverage? Vaughn looked directly at the jury. I don't believe it. I know it. And he described rooms with hidden cameras, conversations recorded, not for nostalgia, for insurance. Once you stepped into his world, you didn't just risk yourself. You risked everything you touched. Then he told the court about the bag. Not a metaphor. A literal bag. Black leather, locked, kept by one of Diddy Combs' closest guards. Vaughn had seen it twice. Once it was opened by mistake. Inside were tapes, labeled, dates, cities, names. The defense finally stood to object. Speculation. The judge stared at them, then simply said, overruled. Vaughn didn't pause. I saw my name on one of the labels. The courtroom exhaled collectively. He continued, you want to know how he lasted so long? Because people were more afraid of what he had than what he'd done. The prosecutor asked, and why are you speaking now? Vaughn's eyes darkened. Because I'm tired of being the only name in the dirt. I did what I did, and I deserve where I am. But I didn't invent this. I learned it. From him. From watching how he smiled while ruining people. He leaned forward. I didn't build the palace. I just slept in the basement. The judge called for a break. No one moved. The jurors stared ahead, hollow-eyed. Diddy Comb didn't blink, but something in his posture had changed. He was leaning back now, deeper in the chair, like the room had grown taller around him. Vaughn was led out slowly, shackles clicking, but his voice still rang in the walls. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was an autopsy. Of silence, of fear, of a legacy dressed in glitter, now stripped raw, thread by thread. The court would resume in 30 minutes, but the damage was permanent, and everyone knew they hadn't even reached the worst of it yet. When the courtroom reconvened, no one made a sound. Not because of formality, not because of protocol, but because every person in that room, from the seasoned reporters to the tight-lipped jurors, understood that what was happening now had crossed the line from allegation into revelation. The lights above didn't flicker, the air conditioning still hummed, but it all felt different. Something had broken, and nobody knew if it could be put back together. Vaughn walked in slower than before. His chains clinked against themselves, but the sound was no longer just mechanical, it had rhythm now, like punctuation to each truth he carried. He sat down without being told, his back straighter than it had been all week. When he looked up, he didn't look at the judge, or the prosecutor, or the audience. He looked at Diddy Comb, not with hate, not even with pity, with recognition. The prosecutor returned to the mic but didn't ask a question. Instead, he nodded once. Vaughn began. They always said his parties were magic, he said. And they were. Everything sparkled. Everything smiled. Nothing was real. He spoke slowly now, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted every word to land. The worst part wasn't what happened in the rooms, it was what happened after. The pretending, the gaslighting, the reward system for silence. He described a girl. One he remembered not because of what happened to her, but because of how she changed afterward. She came in full of life. An upcoming singer. They flew her in for exposure. She left 3 days later with a broken stare. Wouldn't talk, wouldn't sing. Said it was like waking up in someone else's skin. Vaughn paused, the courtroom hanging on every breath. She remembered faces, not time. She remembered voices, but not who they belonged to. They called it dissociation. I call it destruction. The prosecutor asked if this was an isolated case. Vaughn shook his head. It happened all the time. That's what made it hard to trace, because they made you believe it was your fault. He went on to describe how these women were picked deliberately. Models from small towns, internationals with visa issues, aspiring artists with no agents. You weren't invited because you were special. You were invited because you had no one to protect you. He recounted one girl in particular, Brazilian, young, barely fluent in English. She wore a dress 3 sizes too big, smiled when told, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. He described how she was taken upstairs and didn't come down for hours. When she finally did, she walked out barefoot. She didn't even take the gift bag. She just left. The room felt like a vacuum. No coughs, no scribbles, just pressure. Vaughn leaned forward. He didn't hurt people in the open. That's what made him dangerous. He created a world where hurting someone didn't look like violence, it looked like hospitality. He explained how women were offered opportunities, and then handed NDAs alongside luxury items, making it feel like gratitude rather than coercion. They left with shame wrapped in silk, and no one followed up. The prosecutor asked if he had ever seen someone resist and what happened afterward. Vaughn nodded slowly. There was a singer in Vegas. She didn't want to play along, didn't want to drink, didn't flirt. She just sat, quiet. He met her again a week later in L.A. Her face wasn't bruised, just emptied. Her agency dropped her. 2 brands pulled out of campaigns. She told me, they said I was too much trouble. He looked toward the jury. All because she didn't fake a smile. One juror sat stiff, his knuckles white around the edge of his notepad. Another clutched her pen but didn't write a word. The prosecutor asked again, why did people stay quiet? Vaughn answered without pause. Because fear is currency. You keep quiet, you get the invite. You speak, you get erased. He described a man, a former bodyguard, military background, barely spoke. One night after a show, the man confided in Vaughn. He said, one day this is all going to crash. I've seen things I can't unsee. I helped cover up things I still pray about. Vaughn asked why he stayed. The man replied, because once you're in, you can't just leave. He's got footage, he's got files. Nobody walks away clean. The courtroom remained still. The defense didn't object. They didn't move. Vaughn continued. Diddy didn't collect friends. He collected leverage. You didn't realize you were being recorded until it was too late. And then you weren't just silent, you were trapped. He looked at the judge. He doesn't destroy people. He deletes them. That's worse, because no one even remembers to ask where they went. The prosecutor asked, do you believe there are more victims? Vaughn didn't blink. More than we can count. More than we'll ever know, because most of them don't even realize what happened until years later. He told the story of a choreographer who started speaking out one blog post, one interview. Within a month, her booking rate fell by 80%. A story about her past substance abuse hit gossip sites. She disappeared. She wasn't perfect, none of us were, but she was telling the truth, and they buried her under noise. Vaughn took a breath, slow and deliberate. You want to know what scared me the most? He asked. That I started to forget, too. I started to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like, because remembering made me complicit. He paused again. And I didn't stop it. I benefited from it. That's on me. The prosecutor nodded. Did you document anything? Vaughn's eyes didn't flinch. I kept a journal, dates, places, names. I gave it to someone I trust, told them to release it if anything happened to me or if this man was ever put on trial. A gasp passed through the gallery. Not dramatic, just shock realigning itself. The prosecutor asked, "Why not release it sooner?" Vaughn answered plainly, "Because truth cost, and I wasn't ready to lose everything. Now I've got nothing left." The judge said nothing. The jury was frozen. Even the courtroom artist had forgotten to sketch. Vaughn sat back. "You think power is loud," he said. "It's not. It's silent. It's in what's not said, in who's not present, in whose stories don't get told." He looked toward Diddy again. That man built an empire out of fear and locked the gates with favors, and nobody wanted to be on the outside of that gate. The judge called a recess, but again, no one stood. No one even exhaled. Vaughn had just dismantled not a man but a machine. And in that courtroom beneath the fluorescent lights and wooden panels, the silence wasn't respect. It was mourning for every voice that never got this chance. The next session would come. But the truth had already arrived, and it wasn't going anywhere. The courtroom was full before the doors even opened. No media cameras were allowed, but every seat in the gallery was taken, every bench crowded with attorneys, journalists, survivors, and people who had once danced to the music of a man now sitting in silence. The air had changed. No longer speculative, no longer waiting to see where the story would go. Everyone knew where it was heading now, and yet no one was prepared for the final descent. Vaughn entered with the same cuffs, the same uniform, but something in him had shifted. He didn't carry the weight anymore. He had left it on the stand over the past 3 days. Now he walked like a man delivering a package he didn't want but knew was his to give. He sat down, didn't wait to be prompted. "I used to think I deserved to go down alone," he said. "But I don't anymore, because I didn't build this alone. I learned it from watching him." He nodded toward Diddy, who remained motionless, only his eyes tracking the movement of the courtroom. "He taught me how to be charming, how to disarm people, how to set the stage so that when bad things happened, it didn't feel bad, it felt normal. He taught me that control doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like red carpets and champagne and NDAs." The prosecutor asked softly, "Was there a specific moment when you realized that?" Vaughn nodded. 2002, Miami, a party. I saw a girl leave one of his rooms with her mascara smeared and her shoes in her hand. I asked someone if she was okay. They said, "She's just overwhelmed. Happens all the time." I accepted that answer. I hated myself for that. He looked out toward the jury. "There are girls who never came back, and the world never even noticed they were gone. That's how efficient the machine was. Nobody even filed a report. Nobody asked a question." He described the final time he spoke to Diddy in person. A private event. No cameras. Vaughn had tried to warn him. "I told him, you better hope no one ever really talks." He smiled and said, "They won't not if they know what's good for them." Vaughn let the words settle. That's when I knew. He wasn't afraid of getting caught. He didn't believe he could. The prosecutor asked what Diddy was most afraid of. Vaughn didn't hesitate. "Not being believed. That's the only thing that would ever hurt him if people finally saw him as a man, not a myth. He paused. So I'm here to do that. He looked back at the jury. Strip the brand. Leave the suits and songs and stories outside. Just look at the man. Then he talked about the girl who haunted him most. Not because of what happened to her, but because she smiled through it. Everyone thought she was fine. She laughed, posed for photos, danced. Then one day she disappeared. No statement, no news, just gone. He asked someone what happened. They said she asked too many questions. He repeated that. Too many questions. That's all it took. The judge didn't interrupt. The jury didn't move. Vaughn leaned into the microphone. Every industry has its devils. Ours taught them how to dance, how to throw parties, how to sell poison with a beat. He turned to Diddy. Your songs played while girls cried, while people disappeared, while lives were signed away for silence. Then he turned back. I told you everything I saw, everything I did, everything I didn't stop. If you still think silence is safety, you've learned nothing from this. The bailiff approached, ready to escort him out. Vaughn stood slowly, but just before he turned, he said one last thing. He thought he was untouchable. But power fades, money fades, only truth stays. And this is the truth. The judge didn't speak. No one did. Not because they were stunned, but because they were finally listening. Vaughn was led out, the clinking of chains marking the end of something. And for the first time in that courtroom, Diddy didn't look like a mogul. He looked like a man finally sitting under the weight of everything that had always been waiting to catch up to him. The trial wasn't over, but the myth was. And in that silence, truth finally had the last word.